Excellent. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. People are still joining, and I'm letting people in. And it looks like some people haven't got their sound sorted yet. So I'll just give it 30 seconds, a minute, while people get themselves set up. And then we will kick off and dive into the fascinating world of data quality trust scales, which I'm very excited about. So I know we're going to have to choose a time to start sooner or later, Samuel, because otherwise people will just keep joining. So let's go for it. Welcome, everybody. It's so lovely to see you all here, particularly on a Friday afternoon. And I recognize some of the names of people who've joined, and they're even later. It's Friday evening, so we're very grateful that you've turned up. So I'm really excited about this masterclass. This one's a bit different. Normally, I do these with my friends or former colleagues and things, but Samuel actually attended one of my data governance masterclasses earlier in the year. And the thing I love about the masterclasses is they're not a formal training course. They're for people who understand the concepts of data governance, but are perhaps having challenges doing it, and everybody gets their turn in the hot seat and shares their challenges, and then it's not just me but everybody else shares great advice. And I can't even remember what the challenge was. I don't know if you can, Samuel, but Samuel piped up and went, actually we've had similar and we do that by data quality trust scales, and everybody else in the mastermind went, what? And Samuel was really kind enough to talk us through them. And everybody was blown away and went, that's amazing. Such a useful tool. And so I was absolutely thrilled when Samuel agreed to actually do it as a masterclass, because I think this is such a valuable way of getting our business engaged and understanding that data quality is a good thing. So I'm going to hand over to you, Samuel, and I am going to just let people in and yeah, generally manage things. If you could put yourself on mute, we'd appreciate it. It's just easier, Sam. You won't get the noises that can be ever so distracting, or personally, I find them. We have tried to allow some time for questions at the end, so please put them in the chat and we'll get through as many as we can at the end. So I'll hand over to you, Samuel.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending. Yeah, my name's Samuel Clarkbourne. I'm the Data Quality Manager at the Independent Office for Police Conduct. And to give you an introduction, a brief introduction to them, they are the UK-based watchdog for the complaint system, police complaint system in England and Wales. My role as Data Quality Manager sits within our data governance function, and we're there to the data quality function is responsible for investigating, monitoring, and helping improve data quality at the IOPC. And that's a relatively new function. We've been there for about a year and a half, I should say. I came in new to that role and helped develop that team. And that is, whilst we were tracking data quality at the IOPC, we were doing it in not a very formal way and often very anecdotally. So what I imagine will be quite familiar to a lot of people is that situation where you are aware of data quality issues in your organization, but you're not tracking them in a quantifiable manner, and you haven't really got a great grip on them or know exactly how to tackle them. So the development of the trust scale process was to give people a way of doing that on a basic level in a situation where the infrastructure for tracking data quality is not very well developed. So to start off with, what is a data trust scale? Well, a data trust scale, it is a measure of how much we can trust the integrity and usability of a data set, a report, or a set of statistics. And it's used by colleagues to decide how they will use data and whether or not they may share it internally or externally. So it's a guide to help people not only just improve their data, but understand how they can use it, the limitations of it, any caveats they should be applying, etc. Our data trust scale system has 4 levels to it. That's untrustworthy, requires improvement, usable, and trustworthy. Typically, the former, untrustworthy and requires improvement, would suggest someone should not share something externally. And if it's usable and trustworthy, that they can, with certain caveats and understandings and limitations applied. Now, those things may sound a little bit subjective. What is trustworthy or untrustworthy, or what is even usable? It's a term. What does that mean? And that's almost the point. What we want to understand is that trust is a subjective question. How much you can trust data depends on many factors that you cannot easily put a number alongside. And so how you rate data and what level of trust you give it will depend on certain factors like how critical that data is, how it's being used, the kind of systems that it's sitting in, the level of security, and the type of data that it's capturing. And I'll get onto that more specifically in a little while. So the practical application of the data quality dimensions that we apply to our testing will be sort of supplemented by qualitative questions. So we will have the quantitative testing, you can see on the bottom left there, which is your more routine analysis, documentation checking, data profiling, modeling, etc. And that's combined with qualitative testing and doing surveys, collecting subject matter expertise, and understanding the use and practical application of that data to come to a final conclusion on the result. And so that is going to be different for every single set of statistics, report, data set, database that we look at, wherever that is. So what are the data quality dimensions? Well, for one, what we wanted to provide in the trust scale is a breakdown or a framework, let's say, of quantitative measures to start off with that you can apply to data. And we've taken those from the Data Management Association and those which are recommended by the government, the UK government's Data Quality Hub. And each of those dimensions produces a numerical metric as an indicator of quality. So that goes from accuracy, so that's to the degree to which data reflects reality, something that we usually check documents for or work with record owners to assess. There is uniqueness, which is the number of duplicates, ensuring you don't have duplicate IDs, names of cases or organizations, for example, things like that. Timeliness traditionally means, in a broader data quality space, where how quick data can get to a user from when it is entered. So in an engineering environment, that might be a question of, if data is entered by a user, how long does it take to pass its way through the pipeline and get into reports? That is something that we look at, but we use it more often to look at where user input requires timeliness. So if an update is required on a case every month, which is very relevant to our work because we oversee a lot of cases, then if an update has to be provided every month, is it being provided? If something has happened, how long does it take for somebody to record that that thing has happened on the system? Questions like that. Completeness is one of the easiest ones. Is there data that is present? And we tend to focus where data is mandatory. And we'll, of course, look at all of it, but we want the focus to be on the most important data in a system. Consistency is where data conflicts. So you might have, for example, in one data set, you might have a country and then a region. You've got a country and then a region from a different country. Well, that's a conflict. That's inconsistent data. But we might also look between data sets. So if you're in one of those workplaces where people love creating Excel spreadsheets for everything, which is very common, people might create Excel spreadsheets that contain duplicate data of what exists on systems. So we might check to see if they are consistent with one another. So if you've got information about a business, for example, or a client on someone's local Excel spreadsheet that is in routine use, we might check that against the system to see if it has consistent information. Usually they don't, and then it's a good excuse to start thinking about whether those spreadsheets should be in use at all. And then finally, validity. So validity is whether or not data meets the expected type, format, or range. So if you have a date column, does it only contain dates? If you have a number, is it within the range of the numbers you would expect? So if you have a good example of that is if you have in there the certain amount of days it took to complete something. If something is never expected to complete in 0 days or over 1,000 days, you might look at the range that is existing within there and assess the quality of that and pick out outliers. So that brings us on to the data quality dimensions plus. If you see the previous dimensions as the framework we'll use in every data quality test we will do, the dimensions plus go one step beyond and look at more subjective qualitative questions that can be picked out through surveys and other sorts of forms of data gathering. And those we've incorporated from the European Statistical Agency in their quality assurance framework. And those are relevance. So is the data actually, does it meet the needs of users? Is a very important question. Something we'll assess all the time, pretty much. Even where data is incredibly poor, that question comes into a lot of relevance because there's no point in capturing data that you don't need. But we will test relevance even where data is in good quality if it is in causing a lot of resource to take it up. It takes a lot of resource to enter data that you don't need. What's the point in having it? Does that perhaps not meet certain expected standards of GDPR, and data protection legislation if you're capturing data that you don't need because you're not limiting the purpose of it? So we'll also look at coherence and comparability. So that means, is the data coherent and consistent and comparable with other data sources and over time? So if you have a data set giving you performance on some kind of work activity in 1 month, can you compare it to the previous months? Is the data coherent? Can you compare it, do time analysis, that sort of thing? So has the data got a consistency to it that's understandable to the user and the reader? And the final one is accessibility and clarity. So is the data accessible? Is it clear and in an understandable format? And does it have the appropriate metadata to allow people to understand it? And those are the kinds of dimensions that we will look at and come to a more qualitative assessment of, rather than sticking a number alongside it, because those are subjective in amount of questions. And those will be used to assess the overall rating that we might give to something. So something might have a usable rating in which it gets quite a high numerical score, but if it doesn't meet the needs of its users, then it might be bumped down a rating to requires improvement. And the point of that is that we're not applying a strict numerical test. We're telling people, do not compare a report about your data set to a data set in somewhere else entirely in the organization, because each one has its own needs and expectations. And that's incredibly important. So to take a look, here's some sample complaints data that mimics stuff that we have at the IOPC, but to be clear, this data and table structure are fake and purely for demonstration purposes. Nothing in here relates to at all cases or names of people that are involved in any work at the IOPC. But it's an example of where an Excel spreadsheet or some other data set may have issues with it. And so some examples that you can immediately see on there, where you've got some duplicate case IDs. On the left-hand side, you can see there's a number of different case IDs. That's because each case has a number of officers on it, and this data set has not been normalized to create two different tables, one for cases and one for officers. So you can see that it then duplicates the case reference and the case name. You can see that the factors data has three different columns in there, which is not very easy to assess, but also has some inconsistencies in spelling and naming conventions. There's certain data in there that's empty, like the start date, not available on every single one. And there are some formatting errors there too. You'll see on case ID 11 that the start date is formatted as a number rather than a date. In Office, you'll also see things like naming inconsistencies. There's a London there that's spelt London, or a London without a capital L. And you'll also see there I've included some consistency problems. So there are a couple completed dates in there that are sitting before their start date, which is, as you can imagine, doesn't make any sense. And so that's just an example of the kind of data that we're typically looking at when we're doing these trust scales. And we're dealing with a lot of denormalized, poorly constructed, and in Excel spreadsheet type data that we deal with. And that's where the trust scale is really beneficial, is being able to assess that kind of data environment, should we say. So when we go to test that data using the basic dimensions, we might produce a matrix of fields like this. It's not formatted quite like this, but that's the basic structure. Is we'll have the fields on the left-hand side, and we'll have the dimensions at the top. And each one will be associated with a coloring system that is purely for illustrative purposes. So they don't correspond to a particular rating on the trust scale, but are there to point out the main issues that we find. And the first thing you'll notice is not everything that we test will be tested against every dimension. Case name hasn't been tested on timeliness, consistency, or validity, for example, because there's no appropriate test or one that was deemed necessary. Factors does not have one on there for uniqueness, because you wouldn't expect a unique case factor or thing about a case on every single one. So you wouldn't test it for that. So we only test things against what we would be reasonable. And also sometimes what can only be tested in terms of resource. That sometimes comes in the accuracy column. Accuracy, testing data against reality, is usually what takes up the most resource, because you're testing data against records, you're working with record owners, you're picking large samples out of a data set to test for those. And so you might not be able to test every single one. So factors is not tested for accuracy there in the example, because it may be that you've not yet been able to obtain the resource for doing it. You won't be able to do it for some time, but you don't let that hold the assessment back. You might refresh it later when that is available, so that you can focus on things that are deemed to be important rather than delay them. And then each of those percentages, as you can see at the bottom, are then compiled into an average. So you have an average for each column and then a total average. And those loosely coincide with ratings, in that typically 90% and above will be trustworthy, 80% and above will be usable, 70% and above to 80 would be requires improvement, and anything below 70 goes into the untrustworthy rating. And that seems like quite a strict set of rules, but it's just what we wanted to apply to ourselves. But as I said, everything will depend on other factors. So in our use case at the IOPC, where we have personal data that we're recording, if it's ever below 100%, you must have an action plan to improve it to get it to 100%. If it ever goes below 90%, then it's deemed as untrustworthy. And that is to assure that we can meet legislative compliance for the use of personal data at our workplace. So reporting on results, as I mentioned, you consider how critical the data is, the errors found, and how it will be used and shared in the rating that you provide. And that's why some will be reported on more strictly than others. And you give it a rating. So we give it a rating, but the rating itself doesn't mean very much on its own, because it's important the conclusions and the recommendations that we come out of that. So each trust scale will have a set of recommendations. They might include training and guidance for staff, might include altering or removing fields. It might include developing monitoring products to track and fix issues. So if we find small problems, we might create a Power BI dashboard that will track an issue that we've found to allow people to go and fix it. Or we might refer the data set to data design. And I put that in bold because that relates to another process within the IOPC, where we help people design data structures and methods for collecting data within the organization. So a data trust scale, if we find that there is a serious flaw with the design of the data collection method of the database itself, it might be referred through that process so that new requirements can be gathered and they can help design a better way of maintaining, collecting that data. So that brings me on to the end of the trust scale presentation. I guess I would just open up for questions now, Nicola. I wanted to leave enough time for that.
Yes, thank you. I did the camera first and then the mute, which was the wrong way around, really. Thank you, Samuel. That was really interesting. I suppose I've got a question while I wait for other people to type in the chat. So please type questions in the chat for Samuel, because you've got this wonderful opportunity now to ask him how this, because you've been doing this for a while now, haven't you? So it's not a theory. I hate it when you go to conferences and somebody shares something which sounds really great, and then somebody asks questions and it becomes quite clear that this is theory and not something that they've actually done in practice yet. But you've been doing this a while, so I think this is really, really a valuable opportunity for people to ask you questions. But I was going to say to you is, have you found how did you find that selling it as data trust scales work better than just doing straightforward data quality reporting? Did that help engage the business better?
Yes, it certainly did, I think, because a lot of people get nervous at the idea of just calling something a quality review, calling it compliance. And but I will say that even with that kind of branding, I should say, in place, people still had a nervousness about it because I think there's a certain apprehension about worrying about what could be revealed, what could be judged, I suppose, about the performance of individuals or teams or departments. And the way that we tried to resolve that was partially through the branding of it, but also through the process of actually doing it. So when we find a willing participant, there's always a willing team or department within your organization. Not everyone's going to reject you, at least I'd hope not. And so when you work with that individual team, you really emphasize to others the benefits of that brought them. And the benefit of that is that the data trust scale helps enable teams to do better rather than blocks them or whacks some compliance on them. And so, for one, the data trust scale at the moment isn't a mandatory process. So it's also not like we're coming in there and saying that people have to do. So people do either volunteer or come to us, or we approach them and they agree. But it's in the examples and the case studies we can show from other teams we've worked with to say, we found issues, but we helped you improve them. And we pulled resource from around the organization to help you. And then that's what I think brings people on board.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think I love that the difference between, the data quality reporting being a big stick to beat them up with and say your data's rubbish, to this being actually something to help them and support them. I really like that. So the questions are coming in now in the chat. So James has asked a good question that says, what things need to be in place before you can begin using data trust scale? So he's put, so example, do you need a comprehensive data catalog before you could start doing this?
So I wish I could say we had a comprehensive data catalog for all of the things that we'd looked at, but I imagine as with a lot of people's situations, even if you have a data governance initiative, it's iterative, isn't it? And it's always making progress. It's never quite all the way there, especially as organizations and workplaces are constantly changing. And we did not find that not having a comprehensive data catalog inhibited us. So it may mean that you have to do a lot more consultation. So if you've not got a data catalog that helps you understand exactly what all those data values mean, what the column headings are, exactly what the processes are that feed into that data, then you'll have to do more consultation with the users, with analytical teams, with engineers, or rely on the experience and knowledge within your own team that you may have already about that data. But we found that the trust scale process also helped us inform a governance program to create data catalogs, because what we'd often find is that when we're speaking to users about a data set, and this is where that consistency dimension comes into play, is that we would discover data through the trust scale process, because we'd ask you questions, we'd ask someone questions. Where do you enter this data? Is there any other data sources that you're using to help the work that you're doing? And then we'll discover, say, an Excel spreadsheet that's actually a data source that we weren't aware of, or you find out some niche about the system that you weren't aware of previously. And so we find that all of the issues that we find in comprehensively reviewing each field helps us work out some of those definitions for later. But no, it didn't inhibit us from doing the trust scale.
That's interesting. So it's almost like it would have been probably quicker and easier to get the data trust scales in place on that data if it had been in the data catalog. But the fact that it doesn't preclude and almost then works the other way and it helps you progress some of the other data governance work, like the catalog.
Yes, and I think that in terms of other things that need to be in place for using a data trust scale, for us, it was simply having our SharePoint site, having the policy written and agreed, having the documentation set up that we needed to do the process from our end, and willing participants. And we used for some of the introductory trust scales that we did, we only used Excel. And so there isn't very much that needs to be in place apart from having the data that you need and having the willing participation of the people involved.
I like that. And I think sometimes just actually getting on and doing it rather than trying to design everything perfectly and saying we've got all of this in place first, that becomes a barrier to doing it. Whereas it sounds like you've actually been very successful in just getting the basics in place and then getting on with it.
Yeah, there's a risk there that you'll there's always a risk when you just try and get on with something that you'll make a mistake that will be an issue. But I think with the data quality trust scale, we're not building systems and we're not building or maintaining critical data. We're reviewing the data, and so mistakes that we make, if there was, or things that I'd say, miss out, are learning points for later, but the risk is worth it in order to get some of those projects done, in order to get some of the assessments done and start to spread that around the organization. And I think there's a certain sense to which some teams, and I think especially ours initially, we think about, oh, how do we get this system in place for everyone? It's not worth doing that. Just do it for the people that are willing to get involved right now, where it's critical, and then worry about everyone else later and just roll it out slowly.
And did you find that perhaps, I always kind of, that's how I say do data governance as well, work with your allies first. But did you find that by perhaps working with some people who were keen to work with you, you were able to prove successes and get some almost like good testimonials from people that then got other people that were perhaps wouldn't have been willing to work with you in the first phases to sign up to work with you later?
Yeah, I think that's it. As I was saying earlier as well, is that if you can prove that in other cases that you've enabled people to use their data better, then people aren't going to see you as a blocker that's getting in the way of them doing the work that they need to do. They see you as someone who can facilitate it. But it was also about getting the term data quality trust scale into the vernacular and into the jargon of what people were discussing. So you would then have people go to board meetings or be talking in project meetings, and they would say, oh, do we want to do a data quality trust scale on this? Or, oh, I saw a trust scale was done here, should we do it there? And then once that was in the regular kind of, became more regular in conversation, then we find more people coming to us and asking us questions about, can you help us with this? Could you look into that? Which is really important.
Excellent. Great advice there. Thank you, Samuel. So Navin has a good question. He's put, does your data design referral include helping teams to devise better controls, e.g. a better quality assurance check?
Yeah, I think one of the consistent, I mean, in general, yes, definitely it is about devising better controls. And that would be done through data design, would certainly look at that. That's not my area, but it's within the data governance team. A part of data quality's advice and recommendations to teams generally may be about quality controls and process. So a good example of that is we might have a trust scale that finds problems with data in our casework, let's say, as an example. And then we develop a dashboard where we point out each of these issues in their own page with a list of cases that people can go to and fix the issues that get highlighted in that report. But then we find we struggle with the uptake of that because it's not clear whose roles and responsibilities it is to fix it. And also there's not much of, get it right first time. There's a lot of something goes wrong, we address it when data quality find it. And so having better controls is a part of what we might recommend. So data design might look at how the system can be designed in such a way to help control, such as data validation. But we would also look at better quality assurance within the operational process. So are people's managers, owners, etc., being involved in that checking at the first stage?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's it. And I think what you were saying there is like making it clear that this isn't just something you're doing standalone. It's part of a wider service offered from the data governance team. So it's a good way to kind of all align with each other and kind of pass off, isn't it? So we have one final question, unless anybody's got anything that they're frantically typing away and hasn't popped up in the chat yet. From Martin, who has said, and this is a really interesting question because this is something that I personally find hard when I'm doing anything to do with data quality rules, is how did you evaluate the percentage of trustworthiness for each attribute in the table? And how did you define the boundaries for trustworthiness?
Yeah, I think it may help for me to go back actually and have a look at that sample data set and that in the presentation, because when we're talking about the rules for each attribute, the percentage, these percentages that you see here are the aggregation, shall I say, of various business rules that we've applied to that data. And each business rule focuses around one of those dimensions. So if we look at consistency, for example, so consistency here of start date at 77%, that will be a rule that looks at the start date and asks the question, does the start date come before the completed date? If it does, then we typically use binary variables for this. So if it does, then it's a 1. That's good. And if it's a 0, that's wrong. And then that can be added up. So then you sum up the ones, divide it by the total count, of start dates that are available. And so that's just one such rule. You would then have rules for other things in there too. So you may have invalidity of office is a rule that will, so we have a standard list of offices, a taxonomy of sorts, I guess, of the correct naming conventions. And then you would test if that office matches any of those, then it's a 1. If it's not, then it's a 0. A lot of these rules rely on the creation of a binary variable of whether or not something is valid or invalid. And then the percentage is simply, as I said, the sum of the ones divided by the total count of values. So that's typically how it works, is that each one of these percentages is its own rule. And then each of those percentages are averaged to create the value that you see at the bottom. And then this total average is an average of every individual field. It's not an average of the averages, as a common mistake people make. It's an average of every individual field.
So that's it. So do you ever try and weight one rule? Because I've had that, particularly when I've been working with other people who are a lot more technical with the rules than I am. But whereby somebody could say to you, the accuracy is more important than the, I don't know, consistency or the timeliness. So that if you failed an accuracy, that actually makes it worse than if you'd failed a consistency check. Do you ever do that, or do you just keep this very straightforward, simple approach?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it comes into that question from Martin, I suppose, as well, about the boundaries of trustworthiness. Because what we were very keen not to do was try to spend a lot of time developing a numerical formula, because we had a lot of data to assess, we had a lot of trust scales to complete. If we tried to develop a weighting system in each trust scale for each bit data set that we analyzed, we would spend more time in that process than it was felt that was necessary. And I think it's certainly a benefit for, should you want to create more regular reporting in months and years to come about issues that you find, to consider weighting. And it's certainly, some people might consider that a weakness of this type of method, that it doesn't do that. But what we try to do is that it gets into that subjective question of what is more critical, what is more important. And so whilst I mentioned earlier that, so you might have an overall rating here of 84%, the 80 to 90 would typically sit something in usable. But if it was decided that any of the data in here was absolutely critical, so for example, like if officer name, and I see like I haven't in my example included an accuracy check, but if we did and it was very poor, then it might be decided that would be marked as untrustworthy because it was personal data that needed to be at an 100% accuracy level, or at least 90% and above. And so, there are subjective questions, there's legislation questions to apply. We just have not included that in the numerical formula to make that strict in any way. But it's certainly something that do want to consider.
So it's almost like you're kind of taking the approach that I always do with data governance. Start as simple as possible, because you can always add the detail and the complexity as you start doing it and you find the scenarios that need it. So I like this. Get it started, because you're right, to do the weighting. I've been in some really painful workshops over the years, and we don't get a dashboard published because people are still arguing about whether their rule's more important than my rule, kind of thing. So I like this, and the fact that you could add weighting later on. And it sounds like the boundaries for the trustworthiness really do depend on each set of data. What makes it trustworthy? Because what you were just saying, it could be that one thing will change the whole the whole whether this record is trustworthy or not. I think that's really, really useful. So we've got a couple more questions. This is obviously something that is interesting people because it's prompted a couple more supplementary questions on the topic. So Navin says, does your trustworthy scale take into account the different use cases require different levels of quality or trustworthiness? So what is accurate enough for one purpose may not be for something else from the same data.
Yeah, that's exactly the case. So there will be different use cases for different areas between data sets and different trust scales, but also the same trust scale. If we look at, I suppose, in the example data that we have here, like the example I gave of officer name, if that was assessed for accuracy and it was much lower than it should be or was expected for legislation requirements for that, then that would be treated as much harsher than accuracy somewhere else. So what's sufficiently accurate, like you say, for one purpose may not be suitable for another. So between trust scales, if you had one for some operational data that was used purely for some internal resource allocation and didn't have much of a bearing on many of our critical areas of the business, then that wouldn't be treated as harshly as, say, a data set that we have which is reported on to the public. So that's also, especially in public sector context, that's something that we have to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So always what you're using it for could change for data that's used for multiple things. That's a good point. So we've come to the end of the questions, unless somebody's got anything that's like just on the tip of their tongue. But thank you so much, Samuel. I think this has been a really useful approach, sharing like a very practical approach on how people can actually go ahead and do this and start showing the value of what it is we're trying to do by improving the quality of data. And I think a lot of the time we go around talking about, wouldn't it be good if the data's better? But you've found a really good way to actually show people. And I think, if you're actually saying, do you trust your data, and you're giving them a mark that makes it really easy for them to go, oh, I hadn't really thought about that before. I might have moaned about the data, but just got on and used it anyway. And now I've got this badge that says it's not trustworthy. So it kind of, I think that's a really good way to get people bought in and that mindset change they need. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this, Samuel. It's been great. And yeah, if nobody else has any more questions, we'll let you go. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining, and hopefully I'll see you all for another masterclass soon. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. Cheers.